If I had tight and stiff hips, here's the step-by-step process I'd follow as a physio to loosen them off. And the first thing I want to say is this. A lot of people think that tight hips automatically means they just need to stretch more. But in reality, hips often feel tight because the body doesn't feel safe, strong, or in control in certain positions. So yes, sometimes mobility is part of the answer, but more often than not, what you really need is better combination of control, strength, and access to movement. So if I was dealing with stiff hips, here's where I'd start. First off, I'd focus on the pelvis. Before I even worry too much about the hip joint itself, I'd pay attention to the pelvis because the pelvis is the base that the hips move from. If you can't control the pelvis well, the hips usually won't move as cleanly as they should. And this is where a lot of people get stuck. They keep stretching the hip, but they've never actually improved the thing the hip is moving off. So I'd make sure I had good control over anterior and posterior pelvic tilt, so tilting the pelvis forwards and backwards, side to side pelvic movement, and more importantly, how the pelvis rotates both internally and externally. And you're probably asking, why does this matter? Because if the pelvis is stiff, stuck, or poorly controlled, your body will often try to create movement somewhere else. That might be your lower back, it might be your knees, or it may just create that general feeling of tightness around the hips because the whole system doesn't feel fluid. So step one for me would be, can I actually move and control my pelvis well in multiple directions? Because if the answer is no, that's often where the first limitation is. Next, I'd focus on how the hip ball moves in the socket. Once I've started improving pelvic control, I'd then focus more directly on the actual hip joint. And here, I pay close attention to how the femur, so the thigh bone, moves within the hip socket. The big movements I'd want to restore are hip internal and external rotation, hip flexion, and hip extension, because these are the movements that most people with stiff hips tend to be lacking in some way. Now, this is also where people often go wrong. Most people jump straight to trying to force the deepest possible stretch, or they aggressively chase end range positions that their body clearly doesn't own yet. And that's usually a mistake, because if you can't control the middle of the movement, your body is very unlikely to feel safe at the end of the movement. So rather than trying to force extreme positions straight away, I'd first ask, can I move into these ranges comfortably? Can I control them? And do they feel smooth, or do they feel blocked, pinchy, shaky, or uncertain? Because what usually changes tightness long term isn't just yanking yourself into a stretch, it's teaching the body that these positions are safe, strong, and more importantly, repeatable. So for me, the priority would be restore comfortable movement in the mid-range first. Then, once these positions feel better and more controlled, I'd gradually build strength through larger ranges and start exploring end ranges more often. That way, mobility doesn't just become something you can access passively for a few seconds, it becomes something you can actually use. So that builds nicely onto point 3, which is then I'd build strength through the range I've unlocked. This part is massively overlooked because a lot of people do enough mobility work to temporarily feel looser, but they never actually strengthen the new positions they've opened up. And if you don't strengthen the range, your body usually won't keep it. That's why some people stretch every day and still feel tight all the time. Their body might be able to access a little bit more movement for a short period, but it still doesn't trust that position under load. So once I'd improved pelvic control and hip motion, I'd make sure I was building strength through those ranges. That might mean slow, controlled reps, isometric holds, working through tempo, spending time in lengthened positions, and teaching the hips to produce and absorb force there. Because strength is what gives mobility meaning. Mobility without strength often just becomes flexibility, but mobility with strength becomes something useful. Something you can actually rely on when you squat, run, lunge, twist, sprint, or just move through everyday life. So if your hips always feel stiff no matter how much you stretch, there's a good chance this is the part you're missing. And lastly, I'd focus on the frontal plane. This is one of the biggest blind spots I see. Most people often think about hip mobility in terms of just moving forwards and backwards motion, maybe a little bit of rotation, but they completely ignore the frontal plane, which is basically just side to side movements. This is incredibly important for healthy hips because your hips need to be able to control abduction and adduction well. That means moving the leg out to the side, bringing it back in, and more importantly, being able to stabilize the pelvis while doing so. Why does that matter? Because if your body can't control side to side movements well, you often get a wobbly single leg control, poor pelvic stability, hips that feel tight or restricted, knees that cave or collapse, and compensation through the back or groin. So the final piece for me would be making sure I felt strong and confident in hip abduction, hip adduction, and my ability to keep the pelvis stable when I'm moving in multiple directions. That's often the missing link between someone having hips that just feel a little bit looser and someone actually feeling athletic, strong, and free in how they move. So as my final takeaway message for you, if you have tight and stiff hips, don't just stretch them harder and hope for the best. Aim to work through this process. Get control of the pelvis, restore smooth hip motion, build strength through the range you can access, train the frontal plane and pelvic stability. That is the stuff that actually helps hips feel better long term, because the goal isn't just to feel loose for 10 minutes. The goal is to build hips that feel strong, mobile, and trustworthy. So on screen, I've shown you some examples of exercises that can help with exactly that. And if you follow the link in the description, you can get yourself signed up to the waiting list for an exclusive early bird offer for my new hip mobility program that I'll be releasing very soon. And if you are struggling with an injury, long-term pain, or a lack of performance, and you have no idea on how to get back to your best, and you'd like to work with myself one-to-one online, then yeah, follow the link in the description to inquire how to work with myself and find out a little bit more information. And yeah, if you have stuck around and made it to the end, I appreciate you. Thank you very much. Hopefully it has been very valuable and beneficial for you, especially if you do have tight and stiff hips. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one.